Hello there, my name is Zack Snyder, and you're listening, watching, enjoying the Blackbar podcast. Happy Halloween or Harvest or whatever it is. Nothing scarier than this season. Oh, I am hearing an echo of my own voice, which has me worried. Oh my gosh. Okay,
it sounds fine on our side.
Yeah.
Nothing scarier than technical difficulties, am I right? Not to mention that, but
might be the case.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to be able to do it with these teeth this whole time. This week, I also have a webcam instead of a normal camera, so nothing scarier than technical differences. Wah!
Differences?
Yeah. Welcome. Today, we'll be talking about. What are we talking about, guys? This has me all thrown off. I committed to the bit and I lost the direction.
You did a great job.
Today, we're going to be talking about Mac versus PC in 2023 and 2024, as well as could Taylor Swift's Eras Tour affect our church services? Because we're all talking about Taylor Swift right now. And then, of course, if you enjoyed the conversation or want to come yell at me about my costume, you can join us in the Blackbar Discord at discord.blk.bar. And then if you need any of our help, not just during the Halloween season with content, come on over to our website at blk.bar. Welcome, gentlemen. How are you guys doing? I know you didn't commit to the bit, even though I asked you to. I guess some
every
people.
Every year I come dressed in the same costume. Seth Rogen,
Boo. I will not make an excuse. I just didn't feel like it. I had no costume this year.
Well, if I have to be the one that's in costume every year, then so be it. We are here, guys.
Are you going to keep those teeth in the whole time?
I don't know yet. Is it distracting you?
No, but I'm just curious if it's difficult to talk with those. And
it's kind of difficult to talk, but I'm kind of getting used to it. So we'll see how long.
I want to see how far you get with them now. I mean.
I'm really looking forward to you talking about like the theological and ethical implications of Taylor Swift's Eras Tour in regards to a worship service with vampire teeth in it.
Yeah.
So we'll see if we get that far.
I'm also love the idea of like, the social media posts from this podcast being like Zach dressed as a vampire. Mm-hmm. It's going to be out of context. It's going to be great.
Listen, that's if nothing else, I'm here to entertain. That being said, Caleb, why don't you take us into our first topic?
Yeah, we got a tale as old as time with this first topic, a conversation that's been raging since as long as these companies have existed, which is the conversation of Mac versus PC in 2023. If you are in any way sort of connected to the tech world and specifically the Apple world, they just had another big announcement last week, and they announced the new MacBook Pro 2023 with the M3 chip that they're extremely excited about. Apple's silicone, all of their CPU chips are ridiculous. They have been ridiculous since they've been announced, and they just keep getting better. There's no really getting around that. And the MacBook Pro specifically that they just announced, both the 14 and the 16-inch, are targeted straight at like the media creative professional sort of person. That like in all of the advertisements, even looking down through the web page, they're talking about the things that, relatively speaking, would be important to the kind of things that we would need when considering a computer.
Sure. Caleb, if we can just set some like baseline before we get into this. I know that sometimes when we get to the oh my gosh, these teeth are something else. Sometimes when we get into the technical stuff, especially when it comes to creatives, sometimes it's easy to get lost into like just kind of zone out. So like, first of all, it's valuable to talk about what the three of us do. I'm a Mac guy. I have very limited experience with PC. You guys have a lot more face time with PC. Am I right?
Most definitely. I'd say I think Nick and I, we've talked about it a little bit before the podcast. We're definitely bilingual in terms of Mac and PC. We are both primarily PC users, PC desktop users. And then when we have to be away from our setup at home, we have MacBooks that we use.
Sure.
So
okay.
But we definitely use both.
there's an awareness, at least with Caleb and Nick, of like the full breadth of the content. For me, I'm just going to be stubborn, and if Jason Kelly's watching, he'll tell me he's been trying to get me to do a PC for years, and we'll get there eventually, I'm sure.
The little lisp is
The
gonna be sending me the
years.
entire time.
Also, do you like my cape? I've got a cape on too. So anyway, but keeping us on track,
Yes.
even though I'm taking us off track. So we have a variety. Oh my God, nope.
It's game over.
No,
we
that's
made
it.
it 5 minutes.
We made it 5
minutes
minutes.
in.
I couldn't do it. It was the lisp for me. So what's valuable to our audience today is that we have a variety of experiences within our team. Some people might be more pro one or the other, and then also the baseline is that the argument has always been that PC versus Apple. Like, you have a lot of people that are super pro PC that says that it's so much more powerful for the price point, and for Apple, they're just always up to date with a variety of experiences and tools and resources that make it a competitive market. It's kind of like the iPhone versus Android debate, right? Like, everyone's lining up for the iPhones,
right,
even though they're probably way more expensive and maybe sometimes not as powerful as the competitor. So that's kind of loosely what this debate is all about.
Yeah. And I would say, so I did a bunch of research, and I would say that the answer, at least in the computer world, is a lot more nuanced than the phone world. I think there are a lot more options, and depending on the answer is, it depends, of course, whether Mac or PC. To some extent, people are just going to pick what they're familiar with, and that's fine. If you're willing to, just try, if you're willing to make a decision specifically based on like price to performance sort of thing, now we can have a conversation. If you just like Macs, then buy Macs. Chances are the time you would save in rendering the video will not be worth the time it took you to relearn how to use the software that you use, right? So if you're already familiar with this stuff, then this is a moot conversation. However, if you are willing to consider a couple different options, the range, the matrix of different options opens up quite a bit. So there's a couple questions you have to ask yourself. The first one is, are you interested in a laptop specifically, or are you interested in a desktop specifically? Because I think the price propositions are different based on either one. For the most part, at low levels, at like low budget, relatively speaking, regardless if you have if you're going Mac or PC, the price to performance is relatively comparable. Like, if you only have $1,000 to spend on a laptop, whether you throw that at Apple or you throw it at Dell, more or less you're going to get similar performance. They'll beat each other out at particular things. The CPU on the Macs, we'll talk about that later, versus the GPU on more Windows based things. Excuse me. But at low levels, it's relatively comparable. Once you start spending more money, now the differences become way more important. On the MacBook side, or on the laptop side, Apple has way more of a ceiling. So like you can really, you can totally, I believe if you spec out the 16-inch MacBook Pro that they just announced, you can spend up to $7,000. Like, it's horrifying how much money you can throw at these things. But the $7,000 MacBook is going to blow away by far and above every other laptop on the market without a question. Their CPUs, the ARM-based processors are just that good. Meanwhile, on the desktop side, if you have more than $1,000 to throw into it and you're putting more money into it, chances are your money is better spent building your own PC, like a Windows-based operating system. And then you have the options of upgradability and everything, which Mac, for the most part, does not have, even in their the Pro line and whatnot.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like the argument always that I always hear for PC is that you have the chance for expansion and growth. It is interesting to hear that about the laptops, though, because I've always assumed that both desktop and laptop have that high customization ceiling. But it sounds like if you're going to go PC, maybe the desktop is better.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that, like, as we're getting into this conversation, like, some of you guys may have heard this. We did a podcast episode in season 1 with Mike Fusaro, the great debate, Mac versus PC. And then we also did a YouTube video on this. So we covered a lot of, like, the basics about this stuff last year or the year before that. So definitely, if you're interested in going deeper, like, definitely go check that out. But I think this M3 chip, Caleb, is probably, I'm interested to hear how that impacts the old conversation that we've been having.
Right. So when we put out a video, like Zach was mentioning, back in 2020, if I remember correctly, and that was
has it been that long?
Immediately before. It was immediately before the M1 chips first got launched.
Yeah.
So Mac was still on Intel CPUs. And just because I understand not everybody is a complete nerd and understands all the letters that I'm using right here. A CPU is sort of the brain of the computer. It is the thing that is doing the vast majority of the processing. We're also going to talk about GPUs in a minute, which is a different kind of brain that's also in your computer. But the CPU, which historically Intel and AMD are sort of the big producers of CPUs, Mac, for a number of reasons, decided to ditch Intel and start making their own CPUs that are based off of ARM technology, which is another word that I'm using that you probably don't know what it means, and that's fine.
Is that like ARM? Is that?
Yeah.
ARM?
There's just a bunch of arms hanging out. It's really crazy. Effectively, in like a traditional computer setup, you have your CPU, which is like it's fixed onto the motherboard, and then your graphics card is sort of down here. And even in a laptop, I mean, they're not in the same places, but they're in different places. And your RAM is sort of over here, and everything is a different unit on a motherboard, and the motherboard is sort of talking to all these things and making it all work. And that's how 98% of computers have been built since the beginning. ARM processors say, screw that, we can make things a lot more efficient if we take all of those pieces and we smash them into one thing that's really tiny, which would be the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, and the SoC are all smashed together into one soldered little piece of tech that is the M1 chip. That's an ARM-based processor. And the advantage of that, they're relatively low power, which means your computer's going to have longer battery life. And because all of those things are built to work together perfectly, the efficiency and the speed that you're able to achieve with those is ridiculous. The biggest downside being you cannot upgrade an ARM chip. It is the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, all of that. You have to decide what you want at the very beginning when you buy the thing. So it's good. It's not upgradable, right? So the pros and cons or whatever.
So speaking for the person that has just like zoned out as you started speaking.
Right.
You said the ARM processors, it's a lot of stuff that's really powerful, but you can't customize it, versus a lot of different individual devices that you can customize over time if you wanted to.
Right.
Okay.
I think an example that I've used to describe it is it's the difference between making a sandwich with all of the ingredients in the fridge already, right? And you could just go here and blah, 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 versus making a sandwich where you get potentially much better ingredients, but you have to go to a different store for each ingredient, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So technically, sure, the components are better, the individual pieces are better, but it takes you way longer to go do those things. And that's where the performance of the Mac, the chips are really good. So all that being said, the GPU element, which is the graphics processing unit inside ARM chips, is kind of mid, and it's been kind of mid since they got launched, comparatively to like
and you're saying
a dedicated
in these
graphics
Apple
card.
in these Apple
Right.
Yeah.
Compared to a dedicated graphics card. So it really depends when it comes to specifically what programs you use often.
Yeah.
Whether or not you should be using a Mac or a PC, because generally Macs are going to kill it on the CPU side, and PCs will have more headroom on the GPU side, at least when you're talking a dedicated graphics card sort of deal. So I just very quickly went through and looked at a bunch of different programs to see, that generally I would expect people to use in our audience, just so you can get an idea what's more important in these different environments. For example, Photoshop is like 80% CPU bound, and then it uses some GPU for some acceleration on particular things like zooming and whatnot. But if you want better performance in there, you want to upgrade your CPU.
And it's worth noting, Caleb, that all these programs that you're testing, that they're workable on both systems.
Yes. I'm not talking about any programs on this list that are only Mac options or Windows options.
Like Final Cut.
Yes. Illustrator and InDesign can scale really well off of both CPU or GPU. It really doesn't matter. Lightroom is almost exclusively CPU. GPUs for a couple tiny things. That's all the graphic design side and photography side. When it comes to video editing, it actually moves around quite a bit. Premiere is almost exclusively CPU bound while you're editing.
Yeah.
And then when you go to render, it starts using your GPU.
Sure.
Why it doesn't use more of the GPU while you're editing is beyond me, but it doesn't matter. So unfortunately, if you're using Premiere, you need pretty good at both.
Sorry, video editors.
What that effectively means is on like an M1 chip, as you're editing, the timeline will be really smooth. But when it goes to render the video, the PC will drive it into the ground, right?
That's like when you hear whenever, I don't know how many of you guys have exported on a laptop, and you just hear the.
Oh, yeah. Like it begins to take off, right?
Yeah. Right.
To the moon.
Fire up the engines.
After Effects, which is also made by Adobe, is almost entirely CPU bound. There are a couple small plugins that do use a graphics card, but it is not really using a GPU that much at all.
Even in the render and export.
Even in rendering, it primarily uses CPU. Now, they relatively recently, within the past 3 or 4 years, have turned on multi-core rendering. So several cores of your computer can be rendering a frame all at the same time, which is great. But it still doesn't use a lot of graphics processing, which sucks. DaVinci, however, is almost entirely GPU and not very much CPU. The only time it uses a ton of CPU is if you are working with footage in the H.264 codec. And if you know what that means, that's important to you. And if you don't, it probably isn't important. In the world of 3D, GPU is king. It always has been, and it probably always will be. If you want to be rendering anything in 3D, you need a good graphics card.
Yeah.
Every benchmark that I saw comparing Mac and PC, even like the top end things, when it comes to rendering, 3D modeling, and animation, all that kind of stuff, every Mac got smoked by every dedicated graphics card.
Yeah.
It was almost a little embarrassing.
Can't say I'm too surprised. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Even something like Cinema 4D is a little bit more CPU bound in the editing stuff, but when you go to rendering, then they go back to GPU. And then for audio, anything audio, almost across the board is going to be entirely CPU. There's very few systems that run off of graphics card. There's not a lot of graphics. Audio.
Yeah.
Not that that's entirely limited to that. So I think the big two factors, obviously, choose the operating system you like and work within that. But when it comes to if you're willing to sort of jump outside of that and learn something new, or you're sort of flexible, or you're bilingual, as we talked about before, if you're trying to buy a Mac, or if you're trying to buy a laptop or a desktop, that's going to impact your choice quite a bit. Personally, for me, if I'm buying a laptop, I'm probably going to go on the Mac side. If I'm going for a desktop, I'm probably going on the PC side. But also it matters a lot what program that you're actually going to be using. If it's something that leans more towards CPU bound stuff, those M1 chips are pretty unbeatable right now. Or the M series chips are pretty unbeatable for the most part. But if you need something that's a lot more graphic intensive, you can't beat a NVIDIA 4090 or something like that. The dedicated graphics cards, which also happens to be good for gaming, which is a hobby that some in our field might have. That whole side is going to be more important. So the answer is it depends.
Yeah,
it depends.
So Caleb, let me throw some propositions out there for you. I know we have another conversation to get onto here, but if I am a media person who gets to spend money once, and I need the most powerful machine that I can to support my content creation, are you saying that in that instance it also depends on what is my specialization? So like if I'm someone that's doing video and photo and graphics, and I have a one-time chance to spend money, and not an excessive budget, but I don't have, maybe we'll be able to do some upgrades down the line. Maybe. But presumably most churches will say we have a budget to buy something once and it's a one and done. What would you say going to the 2024 year that a media creator within the church should lean toward? Or maybe there's a valuable disclaimer to say it's customizable, as you've said, but I'm just curious what you would say in this conversation.
Personally, the first question I'm going to ask is, do you need a laptop or would you be okay with the desktop? Because there's no question. It is cheaper to get good performance in a desktop than it is in a laptop. And if you have the same budget to spend on both sides, putting that money into a computer that doesn't have to be portable will get you more horsepower. But there are some creatives that need a laptop. Like that's just functionally important for the job that they do.
Sure.
And if that's the case, then, I would go more towards the MacBook side personally.
Well, there you have it. I don't have a budget for either right now, but it's a great idea to look into. Thank you, man. I hope that's helpful to those in the audience. I don't know if we have any questions or anything today, but I think what's valuable, Caleb, about what you said is not only is it subjective, but also there are some trends we're seeing going into the new year. So I'm curious to see how the new chip will continue to perform. Because I don't know where they are, like that was just released. There's a lot of potential for what it could be, because I think this month, November 2023, is the official launch of it. So hopefully we'll see continued good performance, especially as they really get into it. I feel like at showcases, it's always really easy for them to have the best control over this instance so that they sell it well. Right. So I'm curious to see how it'll do in the wild once we really get into the practicals of the M3. So.
I'm excited to try one. I'd like to play with it and see what it can do. I'm excited for the actual benchmarks to show up, not just what Apple tells us it is going to be. It's also worth noting that there have been a lot of Windows ARM-based processors, like kind of in rumors, like it is being worked on. When that shows up, at least the laptop side will be much more comparable.
I was going to ask if we've heard any response yet from the PC development world to Mac's new stuff. It's a little early, but it sounds like what you're telling me is that they're working on it.
Yeah. And I do think it makes a lot of sense in a laptop environment. Like Greg said a little earlier, there are some laptops that do offer you the ability to upgrade specifically RAM and storage, usually not like the CPU or GPU or anything like that.
Sure.
But meanwhile, Mac, you used to be able to upgrade the storage and the RAM. With the new ARM chips, you definitely can't upgrade the RAM. I don't think you can upgrade the storage. And they charge you an arm and a leg if you want to upgrade the storage, because I think the base model comes with like 512 gigs or something like that. If you want to go up to like a 2 terabyte drive, I think it's like a $500 increase or something. It is horrifying how much.
200 terabyte? How many? 2 terabytes.
2 terabytes is like 5. You know how much 2 terabytes would be if you just bought the drive? It would be a lot less than that money.
I mean, we work off of we purchased those T7s way back. There are 2 terabytes, and right now I think they go for like 150 or something like that.
Yeah,
it's not a lot.
It's not that much money, and the fact that you can't upgrade it afterwards. Meanwhile, on the Windows side, you can. Greg is mentioning the Framework, which is a very cool company that makes completely upgradable laptops where you can like pull out the CPU and the GPU, and it's very cool. They're very cool. Check them out. But that's a very particular kind of customer that Greg is, and most of our audience is not, and that's totally fine too. Anyway,
I love it.
Nice. Well, guys,
hey, if anyone gets an M3 chip computer and they want to send it our way so we can test it out, just let us know.
Just mail it.
Hey, you know what?
Mail it over.
Apple, this is your chance. You can become a sponsor of the Blackbar podcast. Here's your opportunity. I know you're a small company.
A small company.
Here's a chance.
Come on.
It's a big opportunity for you.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, I caught you off. I know you were heading into the next one, so
you're good. So probably the reason why a lot of you guys clicked on this here, we also want to talk about Taylor Swift and how her Eras Tour could be affecting the church. this kind of came up because I started seeing a whole bunch of videos on TikTok of people recording in the theater, and people are just going nuts in the theater, like, singing along, jumping around. I think the one that really caught my eye is they had like everyone was holding hands and running around in a circle. And as a person who feels that film is very important, that cinema is very important, my first reaction, honestly, was I was upset. I was like, "What are you doing? This is
inside of a movie theater."
Oh yeah. Like people are getting out of their seats, going down to the front aisle, and running around. And my initial reaction was very negative, right? And it took a little bit of time for me to get to the place where I was like, this is okay. There are some really good reasons behind this thought process, but I do think for like a lot of people who are very much into cinema, there could be some very negative reactions. And Caleb, I know I would consider you to be one of those people. I feel your list of movies you think are good end after There Will Be Blood, and the one before it is
sure. I don't.
He's a big Taxi Driver fan as well.
Oh yeah, you're right. Taxi Driver. There's 3 films.
I don't watch a lot of movies, but I do watch only very good movies.
Yeah.
Taxi. What did you say, Nick? What was the other one? You said Taxi Driver.
It's 4 now. Taxi Driver, Magnolia, There Will Be
Everything
Blood,
Everywhere
and
All at
Birdman.
Once.
Everywhere. Okay, there's 5 now.
Birdman.
5 films that Caleb has watched in his entire lifetime.
Excellent. Well, yes. Sure.
And Taylor Swift.
And the Taylor Swift Eras Tour, which I went to on opening night. So technically, I went to it when it was originally announced to be opening night, but apparently that sold out. So she opened up more tickets the day before. So there were people who saw it before me. But I went to, and I'll also clarify that this was not necessarily because I was super excited to see it, is because my wife was super excited to see it. And we weren't going to blow $1,000 on actual Eras Tour tickets.
For sure.
So $30 to go see her. And the thing, we also brought my sister-in-law with me as well.
And to your credit, you were a Taylor Swift fan back in college, especially. So you've got enough of respect of her to enjoy the experience.
I do respect Taylor Swift, and she's not my favorite musically. I got very much into her in high school. I worked to get into her because my girlfriend at the time was very into her. Now my wife. So
that's cute.
I have like worked to become a Taylor Swift fan, and I think there are very few people in the entire music industry that have gotten to the point of success that she has right now. Like she is in a list of single-digit names of people who have had the kind of impact that she has. All that being said, I went to the Eras Tour on day 1. I didn't realize it was going to be 3 hours and change long. It was very long.
Did you wear pink?
I did not wear pink.
Did you wear sparkles?
I was
if you're gonna commit, you gotta commit.
I was more of like a Reputation girly. I was doing the all black thing, so it worked.
Did you know all the words to say during the songs?
There were a few that I knew. I did not sing along, but like when she sings "You Belong with Me," there isn't anyone in the room that doesn't know the words. All right,
sure.
I know because they were all screaming them over.
Oh my gosh.
So I went there, and I had seen little clips of people like dancing in the aisles and stuff beforehand, but that was very much the experience. There were people like, fortunately nobody got up by the screen. I would have been a little annoyed at that, but all through the aisles and whatever, people were jumping up, dancing, mostly teenage girls, running around, singing, crying. There was crying. Like everybody was super. It was very much like a live experience. And like Nick was saying, something that I've never experienced in a movie theater before. Usually audience participation in movie theaters peaks at like horror movies when people scream for the most part. Or like Endgame when you hear someone say "on your left" and everybody knows what that means except for me. I don't know what that means, right?
Or Christian movies when they're like, "Hey, please stand up if you feel called to this," or something.
Really cheesy Christian movies. So for the most part, it doesn't really happen. And I had a relatively positive experience at the thing. I thought it was really cool, honestly, to see everybody like it's cool to see anybody excited about stuff. Nobody gets excited about anything anymore. Everybody's depressing. So for all of those people to be like so tightly connected and so excited about, sure, Taylor Swift, it was inspiring. It was fun to be a part of that atmosphere. But it did sort of result in the conversations. Nick and I were talking about it afterwards, and the three of us were talking about it afterwards, of like and I'll use this word, the meta of what movie experiences like has sort of this newcomer now of like, that's a new thing. That's a weird thing. I don't know if it's going to dramatically change how movies are watched moving forward. Personally, I don't think like this is gonna like affect just a typical, whatever next movie Scorsese puts out or whatever. Generally speaking, I don't think people are gonna be running around in the aisles and whatnot.
I don't think
the 4-hour movie that he just came out with.
Yeah. I heard it's good. I also heard it's maybe a little
lower.
Anyway, yeah.
Could be
I feel like there's two things that are worth noting before we like kind of merge. One, and Nick, this you brought to us. I think it was the president of the AMC theaters encouraged engagement.
Yeah, that was the craziest thing. Is I also saw that on TikTok, and that was one of the things that really changed my opinion, is because he released a video, and it's very possible the video was played before the Eras Tour premiere, right? Like in the theater, where he's just saying, basically he was correcting
for what it's worth.
Okay. Were you at AMC?
Yeah.
Interesting.
He
was, encouraging people who were there to participate, to scream, sing along, jump up and down, a couple of things like don't do this, don't do that, but like have fun. And, one of the reasons why I started thinking about this, like, you're allowing the audience to do that, but it's like, think of like theaters are in real trouble. Since 2020, theaters have been in a lot of financial trouble.
It's 2023 now, and they're still struggling. Yeah.
They need to come up with a way to change what they're doing to bring people back to the theater. And a lot of summer blockbusters, there are some summer blockbusters that did well, that did that, but it wasn't consistent.
Yeah.
But this format, this kind of thing, I think really changed that. And the thing I think that's the linchpin here is that it was a more experiential thing. It was something that you got to participate in rather than just sit and observe. And
not just but you were encouraged to participate in.
Oh yeah, right. Like you were given permission. I can't say last time I was in the theater watching even a Marvel film, right? Like Caleb was saying, the most you get is like gasps and people shouting when gosh, I don't know if I can spoil at this point. It's been a few years, but like, that one moment when one character grabs the hammer, right? Everyone's like, oh my gosh, I knew it. Right. So.
But the thing too that I wanted to make sure we didn't skip over, it's kind of like a counter thought, is that I don't know if this could have happened on just about anyone else other than Taylor Swift, especially right now in culture in this time. She's currently dating Travis Kelce from from the NFL, which has been a huge thing. I just talked to a friend that was like, I think this could be a total publicity stunt, which I mean, if you're being super skeptic, yeah, sure, we can get into that, but I don't know if next podcast we'll talk about the capitalism mindset, but as far as the Taylor Swift experience goes, I can think of maybe 2 or 3 others, like a Beyonce or maybe a Billie Eilish could pull something like this off.
Sure.
But even then, like it's this high level of production and popularity and fame that was able to make something like this happen, which I think in a lot of ways is the only way something like this could have been encouraged from the get-go. However, I wonder how replicatable it is outside of an experience like this.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's impossible that we will see more tour movies premiering in theaters. I know this isn't the first one that did it. A couple of years ago, I went to there was a short film, not short film, it was like 45 minutes to an hour of a film that only was in IMAX and never released anywhere else for Kanye West's Jesus is King album.
Yeah.
And that was amazing, and I loved it. And Kanye's gone off the deep end, unfortunately, since then. But
I feel a little more than just that. But yeah.
Yes. Apparently, he was supposed to have an album that came out on Friday, or today, but surprise, surprise, got delayed. If you have ever been a Kanye fan, that is not a surprise at all. But so this isn't the first time. But with the success of this, and I imagine the ridiculous amounts of money that Taylor Swift seems to be printing off on a daily basis, there will be more. We will see more of these.
Yeah.
Will that affect other movies? Like Greg was saying, the soundproofing between movie theater rooms might need to be increased a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not built for that. I would
absolutely believe that if someone was watching a movie in the theater next over, they would have heard this. There's no way. Sure. It was like I was having difficulty hearing the actual movie with how many people were singing and screaming.
Yeah. And that's the thing that makes my cinema brain just like, it's like I want to hear what's going on, but
it's interesting. I mean, like you look at like this year, of course, Barbenheimer happened. We had a podcast about it.
Right.
I did not experience that at either of those films, and they are arguably the biggest films of the year. And so I don't know, it's just such a different dynamic, you know, to imagine if people would have been, I mean, I think you had a lot of people dressed up as Barbie, and you had a lot of people that were also dressing for the Barbenheimer experience and wearing all black and looking like Oppenheimer. But like it kind of stopped at the pre-show experience, and once the movie began, everyone was fully engaged and connected, at least in my experience with it.
I don't know what sort of singing and dancing could have been going on during Oppenheimer.
As soon as the bomb goes off, everyone just like
maybe Barbie slightly more, but
also spoiler, the bomb goes off.
I'm just kidding.
The bomb goes off in Oppenheimer. What? Anyway,
what?
Maybe spoiler. A sing-along. You have seen sing-along movies, like they'll post like I think it was Frozen 1. They released the limited run sing-along experience, so I'm sure that one targeted toward kids was a lot more engaging.
But I'm curious for something like a Hamilton. Did that ever come out in theaters? I know there's like an Apple Plus version. I don't know if that actually went
I don't know.
to theaters.
I don't think. Maybe
I'd be
definitely went to
curious
streaming
if people,
sites,
I'd be curious if people were singing along if that
But
had a premiere.
let's look at that.
Like that.
In the Hamilton experience on Broadway, I imagine they would not encourage you to engage and stand up and sing.
No,
so
not.
I mean, wasn't there a congresswoman that was thrown out recently because she was singing along to a
among other things? But let's not
get into that.
Congress.
I love how you guys both at the same time were like among other things.
Yeah.
So I think what we're starting to trace here is kind of the first real question that I wanted to get into is how is America's approach to experiences starting to impact us, not just on a personal level, but also on a faith-based level. So like we see an invitation to engage with a in-concert experience. In the Eras Tour live concert, there's absolutely an invitation to engage. However, the mix is in a way in which the concert is a predominant and everyone that's singing along is the support. And then you head into Broadway, or then you head into more specific cinema. You head into a Scorsese film, and then they have not engaged. And I would be surprised if like a Broadway would ever truly engage with people, inviting people to stand and sing and dance during the performance. So I don't know. I'm curious to see how much this, I'd say, I don't want to say it's not going to happen again. I think it's very unique. I'm curious to see how much we're going to see a swing when it comes to the culture, especially for movie theaters that are suffering, where they're trying to find more. I don't want to say it's a gimmick, but they're trying to find more ways for audiences to want to come experience. Right. And if that means elevating it and getting people involved and personally invested, I mean, that feels like we just saw it work with Taylor Swift. So
yeah, I do want to bring a small amount of, I guess, like a point of order clarity sort of thing is that I do feel like I was equally, if not more so, engaged watching like Oppenheimer in the theater than I was Barbie. I feel like engaged might be the wrong word, but like certainly the participation outside of like, because engaging, like you can engage me and I could be doing nothing. I could just be like absorbed in what is happening versus running around it's gonna be hard for me to be so excited about something I'm jumping up and dancing and singing along and all that kind of stuff. But that's not my personality. Obviously I was in a room full of people who did have that personality, and that was fine. My sister-in-law has that personality. I wish she could hit notes more often sitting next to me. that was fine. She was having a blast. That's all that mattered. So I think when it comes to, because the transition that we want to make over here is when we look at the church, then, right? And the church, generally speaking, and I think it's also important that we put another point of clarity out there, is that the three of us have experience in, relatively speaking, like charismatic evangelical churches. We do not have a lot of experience in liturgical churches. So part of this conversation may not be super relevant to you if you are generally picking up a hymnal every single week. There's less flexibility in that sort of space. So we want to acknowledge that. But in evangelical charismatic circles, the first 45 minutes or half an hour or so of every church service, for the most part, is going to be the worship set. And that's going to be maybe 2 or 3 fast songs. Then we're going to say a short prayer or something, and then we're going to go into a couple slower songs, usually like the praise set, and then there's the worship set, and then maybe you have an altar call depending on how the spirit's moving or whatever, and then we move on. And participation in those experiences is going to fluctuate based on your church's culture, how good the worship team is that day, how much the spirit is moving, whether that's hand raised sort of deal, dancing around, singing along, all the, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, at the very least in our lifetime, and chances are through most of our parents' lifetime, the goal and the aesthetic and the tools used to achieve an atmosphere of worship have been extremely consistent, right? The genre has changed a little bit. We have drums now, and my dad didn't grow up with drums in the, when he started playing drums during worship, it was a big fiasco. And maybe there's slightly less delay on our electric guitars than we had 10 years ago. But for the most part, the vibe of worship music has been relatively consistent, and the expected participation level of the people in the congregation has also been relatively consistent. And how many of us have heard sermons or preached sermons about the idea of that worship is not music, right? Worship is a lifestyle. Yeah. Worship is a mindset.
Worship is what you do.
It's not just an experience or anything. And yet, in a congregational setting, worship has a very limited, very specific definition, in that we're going into a time of worship now, and our time of worship looks the same way every week without end. You have your dozen songs that you're picking between, and maybe you pull something out from the vault every once in a while. But it kind of has been the same thing for a long time. And I think it's worth having the question for those of us that might lean a little bit more innovative in general and want to see like change and experiment in that sort of field. Is there room for us finding new ways to worship our creator, either through different styles of music and different aesthetics there, or just entirely different ways? Like, you don't need music to worship, right? What are other ways that we could do that? And, that's sort of the conversation that spurned out of us talking about, girls screaming in Arrows movie. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts since last we talked about this sort of thing.
There's definitely that connection between, that cinema snob culture that I had, right? In feeling like, well, you can't change this up. You can't make this different, right? That I feel could, 50 years ago, it was the drum thing, right? And electric guitars. Throwing those out, keeping those and throwing out the organ, right? Like, but it's interesting to think, like, in my knowledge of church history, right, there's been a lot of worship services being primarily music related, at least in the last 100 years that I'm aware of. Man, I would love to see something different. And I think the challenge is when it's corporate, right? Like, it's very easy for everyone to get on the same song with the same lyrics and participate together. It's more difficult if you're like, all right, everybody, here is some pen and paper, go draw, write some poetry, journal, whatever you want to do, right? And we're just going to sit here for a little bit, and then we're going to talk about it or something.
Right. I know an example that I've talked about with pastors in the past is the idea of, the sharing of testimonies, right? Which is not something that a lot of churches do anymore, probably because they got one too many really weird people sharing something that they can't control.
Kills, that's like the one time you told us about a person that got saved at a church you were attending at the time.
Yeah.
And then they just started shouting explicitives. They were
yes.
so overwhelmed by how good their experience with God was.
I effing love
shouting.
Jesus.
Yes, they did. They screamed it in the lobby.
Oh my God.
And the pastor, like, God bless him, celebrated with him, and then afterwards talked a little bit more and some of the cultural things there, which that was the correct way to handle that situation.
100%. Good job, pastor.
Yeah, and I think the sharing of one's testimony is a fantastic way, like hearing what God is doing in people's lives on the mic live and just encouraging each other back and forth. Like, absolutely, that can bring about an atmosphere of worship that doesn't even necessarily require music. And you can even, you know, put your keyboard up there and put 1461. You can play little things in the background,
right?
That's fine. But like, there are other ways to bring about worship that don't necessarily require that. And I do think that mixing it up from time to time is a really interesting way, not only of keeping your congregation on your toes. It's not just innovation for innovation's sake, but practicing, exploring various areas of worship corporately encourages people experimenting in how they could do that personally in their own lives. Because not everybody worships to music personally as well as they do other things. I know for me personally, it's a lot of reading. It's a lot of pacing around my basement or my first floor and just praying and talking to God and having that sort of experience. Sometimes it's having conversations with other people, whether that's theologically focused or philosophically. Those are the times that I feel closest to God, right? It's not necessarily sitting in a church service and playing Oceans for the 400th time necessarily, right? Different people, you know, connect with God in different ways, but we only really connect with God this way in a church service.
So let me throw something out there. I got a couple thoughts, and I can hear Nick winding up. I can just feel it. I have a couple thoughts. First, connecting our themes. One is what Taylor Swift did. Is that considered art?
Art,
of course.
Okay, so then the concept is that music, performance, engagement is art. So then would you consider worship services art?
Yeah. They're not always good art.
by definition, art. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I guess a question then is, what, you know, this is too broad of a question. What is the purpose of art within the church? And does the current framework by which evangelical spaces engage with worship check that box of art? Because I feel like in a way, I know how the three of us think. And I feel like in a lot of ways, we're looking to be engaged with. And I think the most effective forms of art is art that engages with us on a deep level. Like, art is subversive because it gets around the blockades that we have up mentally and emotionally and in our present realities, and it hits us in a deeper way. And kind of what I'm hearing about the tensions that we're feeling with worship is that in many spaces, it doesn't feel like it is that subversive experience that we're looking for when it comes to art that we're hitting. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that almost feels like a central tension that we're experiencing here.
Yeah, I do think, no question, worship music in general is art, whether it's good or not. It's relatively speaking subjective. The goal of art in the church probably changes. It probably differs. Sometimes it's to bring about, a more worshipful tone experience and stuff like that. Sometimes it's to communicate a specific message, to your congregation, to bring about life change or whatever, anything like that. So I would imagine to some extent it fluctuates. However, one thing that I think, because I love art, I'm really big into art, really big into fashion. It's something I digest regularly. There is a word in the art world that is probably the worst thing that can be said about someone's art. That could probably be said about almost all I won't say Christian art in general, but at least the kind of art that we experience.
Wait, can we guess? Can we guess?
Worship.
Can we guess what the word is?
Mid?
Sure, you can even have a guess. Go ahead.
Is it mid?
No.
I was gonna say unoriginal,
Bro, this
or
is
uninspired.
super mid. More or less, the word is derivative.
Sure.
So for you to have a piece that is derivative, it is something that is aesthetically matching the vibe of things that have happened already without offering any new ideas.
Sure.
In on top of that, right? So like Jackson Pollock invented the idea of like the super expressionist, like throwing paint on the wall sort of things.
Yep.
And we've had anybody in an art class in like the 8th grade have a project where they have to do something like that.
Sure.
And every single one of those pieces is derivative. Aesthetically, it matches, but it's not offering anything new to the table necessarily, right?
Yep.
And I think you could say about 90% of the art used in congregational worship services is inherently derivative. And I do think that that's a problem because it leads to a feeling of stagnancy where I'm sort of getting the same thing every time. To some extent, it's consistency, and I do think that's sort of the thing that they're trying to balance is that they want to make sure when you show up on a Sunday morning that you, for the most part, you kind of know what you're getting because everybody's very concerned about retaining guests. So a consistent experience is one that I feel safe coming back to every time. But also at the same time, encouraging and pushing people forward with new experience and new arts and new perspective, new ways to think about things is how we bring about the life change in the guests that we want to stick around, right? So I recognize it's a balance, but I feel like right now, personally, it's really hard on one side when I can be playing a song from 15 years ago that came out in the general CCM world, and it just slides right in aesthetically with a lot of the new music that's coming out right now. You can talk about any other genre of music, and that, for the most part, maybe other than country, cannot be said, I don't think.
So if I can help advance the conversation, it sounds like broadly we're recognizing that there has become a meta or a standard of Christian music, specifically in the evangelical Protestant world. That's kind of what the tension that we're dealing with here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, clearly a lot of things have had to have worked to get us to where we are. I think that there's, in the history of the process of arriving at this music, the reason it's been replicated so much is because the original creator, the Jackson Pollock of the contemporary Christian music world, set a standard that was truly impactful and registered with people on a deep spiritual level. So I think that was probably, an origination of this. I mean, would you guys?
Yeah, I do think that there's been a handful of artists over the years that have, like Christian CCM, like worship artists that have actually like made notable steps forward. Most recently, I feel like Maverick City has been punching above their weight pretty heavily and making some changes in there, which I do appreciate aesthetically the direction. It's not my favorite music in the world, but I will take it. If any change, I will take it.
There you go. Maybe we can have Chandler Moore on the podcast, and he can talk about this more in depth.
There you go.
Obviously, Hillsong, when they first broke out on the scene, was pretty. They really brought, I'd call it like arena rock to the world of worship music. Bethel obviously had a huge impact as well. But then I think for the most part, they like hit a thing, all of them, they hit a thing, and then that was the thing they were known for. And they kind of just kept evolving on mostly the same, which most artists do. And no artist can ever win because you do the same thing that you want. And they say they want something new, and you do something new and they say they want more of the old thing. Exactly. And I recognize that. But I do think the standard for innovation in the church world of art is lower across the board. And I do think for it, as long as that is the case, we will always be, at least in the world of art, behind in terms of expressing Christian ideas and whatever through that medium, which is a shame. because we led the way for so many hundreds of years.
Yes,
Sure.
and I do have like two thoughts that feel like need to be stated, and I think Richard Lake shared an important one. And the first is
Richard's
that
sharing so
he
much. I
shared some
love
good
it.
stuff in the comments. A couple episodes back, we had Sheree Bishop on, and she got to talk about the intentionality of worship structure over an arc of a service. And I think that's a valuable conversation to hear if you are interested in hearing more about this conversation, because I think that does help us get a little bit more insight into within the evangelical Protestant, or whatever word you want to use, within this current sphere, there can be a way to find an intentionality that helps drive again, intentional art. I think that there can be a reality in these spaces where that can still happen. Even if there is a meta, I think it's still valuable to engage with the reality of uniqueness, even within the realm that you're creating in. Thing number two, we had Nikki Lerner on in season 1. She's a multicultural coach. She talked a lot about this as well, because she was able to bring a different perspective to our conversation. And then in which she was talking about, whenever possible, it's so important to create your own art for your own community that has a voice that only you can bring to your congregation. Right. And I think the reality is that to Richard Lake's conversation, the reality is that sometimes that is capped off by the size and the scale of your church. Our church has a partner church that's in Wyoming, in which it's like maybe 20 people. They're not probably going to be able to have the capacity to do a ton of innovation beyond the experience and the skill level that they have in their very, very, very tiny town. So there is an instance in which they're going to do what is most valuable to their community. And I think ultimately that church would be more striving for unified worship than unified artistic innovation. So I think that's something that's valuable to see when it comes to the size. I'm not saying that they can't. I am saying this is just in the context
Caleb,
of that.
I want to hear from what you, and then I got something.
So I think yes, but I will give, in terms of church worship service innovation over the past 15, 20 years, one area where we have continued to see improvement and more resources and definitely way more money put into it is everything around the experience of worship, being the lights and the sound system. And we went from overhead projectors to, color projectors to now full scale LED walls, to smoke machines, and all of that in effort of creating an atmosphere of worship. And I understand there's people who don't care for all that stuff. Do I think it's the most important thing in the world? Absolutely, I don't. And I say that as a media professional who wouldn't have a living if it wasn't for those kinds of technologies.
Sure.
But that is all in pursuit of a level of production value that to your point, that I don't necessarily think is critical for having like an artful experience, a innovative experience in an artistic way for a worship set. I could point to someone like Bob Dylan, who was a folk singer from like the 60s and 70s, who was just a dude with an acoustic guitar who can write a mean song and literally change the culture for a decade, if not more. And he was just a dude with an acoustic guitar. So I don't think it takes, obviously it takes someone with the talent, and if you only have 20 people to pick from, the chances are you're going to find someone with that talent is going to be lower than if you have 2,000. But I don't believe it takes huge teams to be innovative in a creative, artistic way, whether that is musically or through other means of worship. It doesn't hurt, but I don't think it's necessarily. And I think smaller churches tend to be more flexible in general because there are less committees and whatever they have to go through to get ideas like that passed.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is I'm not trying to take the big churches that are in a place of innovation or advancement off the chopping block if you guys should be artistically advancing worship, not just through contemporary music. I am saying that I think the most important thing for a small community, for example, let's say they have one person that does music and they're getting burned out because they've been playing music every single week. I think it's more important to have an engaging, connected, unified service based around worship that maybe, let's say Oceans. Maybe Oceans is the song that's going to move us today, and we're going to move together because we're on the same page. I think that might be more important than just making art because we need that art to be able to help us experience something different. I'm not saying they're
Sure.
mutually exclusive. I am saying in like a small church setting, for example, a smaller community, I think it would be more important to worship together. And that doesn't have to just be music, but worship together over innovate. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. You know, it's so there seems to be a similar thread here of something that actually happened with Blaze Nelson, one of our certified pros on the Discord. He wrote a song for his church. And I wish Blaze was here because he'd probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like he wrote it because the church had just been in a certain season, and it was a song that came out of that season that he felt like the congregation needed to hear. And like, I think about like, you know, there's a marketing thing that we talk about a lot that like, you know, you need to talk to your audience, right? We'll talk about how we don't want, every church shouldn't look like the graphics of Hillsong or Bethel or all these bigger churches, because each church has a unique culture. And I feel like a point that's kind of between and linking both of what you guys are saying is like for Blaze, he did a great job in creating art that was specific to the culture of his church.
Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, I wish he was on because I wish he could tell us a little bit more about it. That was cool.
I also think another very important factor with art in general and worship services notwithstanding, is that art in general is like 80% context and 20% the actual piece itself. And that the story around it and the conversations it's having with other art and the story of whatever medium it's in at the time plays a big part. I like the number one example that I can think of in my head, specifically in terms of a church scenario. Nick still attends Grand Rapids First. I'm on the opposite side of the state, but I worked there for a number of years. And a extremely close friend of ours, and I'm not going to get emotional about this right now because I'm doing a podcast, but she passed away. And she, Sarah Reifkogel, she was the daughter of our lead pastors. And she was also sang in worship every single week. Pastor Drew was our lead, and she was right beside him. And when she passed away, she had cancer. During the celebration service, managed to have play a song that we sang regularly. Yep. And while that was happening, there was a recording of her singing the song happening at the same time. So she sang her own celebration service. Wow. And there was not a dry eye in the room. I get emotional thinking about the moment.
Yeah. I was going to say, you didn't warn me about this, dude.
I know.
Yeah.
But the amazing, like the experience of worship in that setting of even in the face of death, being able to connect on that level. I can't even remember what song it was because it doesn't freaking matter what song it was, right? The art was more than the song. It was the song in the situation, right? It
was the context.
So even if you're not writing your own music necessarily, there's something important about understanding the context of the culture that you're in as your church specifically, your town, your city, even a specific group within your church, and choosing the right music, choosing the right way to connect with them. It's such an important piece of the puzzle, and I'm worried that for a number of reasons, obviously Sunday's always coming. We have a lot to do. We have a set list to pick every single week. We're dealing with musicians that 9 times out of 10 are not professionals, right? I have a friend that I grew up with that played bass for like 3 or 4 years, like the only bass player on our youth team that had the notes written on the frets because she couldn't be bothered to remember them, right?
Oh boy.
They're not professionals. The music needs to be relatively simple to be able to be executed. The melody and the lyrics need to be relatively simple for the people to be able to sing. There's a lot of factors going on. And yet, I feel like there's still room, whether that be aesthetically through the genre that we're choosing, whether that be outside of music altogether, to find ways to worship our creator in ways that hasn't been done, that perhaps could make an impact on people that what we're doing currently isn't.
Yeah.
And we'll never know unless we're willing to experiment.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, man. I appreciate that. I think the one objective that I want to make sure that we don't do is, if you are listening and your church is not in a space in which they can innovate artistically, and we continue to pick on Oceans because it's easy. You know, we all cried to Oceans
Easy
at one point,
target.
and now we're just like, oh dang, it's Oceans.
Right.
Again. But
Right.
if there is a church in which they're in a season in which Oceans is exactly what they need, I don't
Yeah.
want to discourage that
No.
church from using that.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
What I would do is what you're saying, Caleb. How can we take intentional choices like that, expound upon them, and then with the resources that God has given our church, grow them? So that doesn't even have to be worship. If that means we'll play Oceans for the next 6 years, I hope that's not the case, because I think then you're going to settle into a space that's too comfortable. However, are you finding the Oceans that every single week and every single season your church most needs to hear? If you're able to write that content and create that content, like absolutely support the artists that can do that, because I think God will bless that in immense ways. However, if you do not have those resources, then try to find, and maybe this is a good segue, try to find what are the ways in which your church can engage artistically, emotionally, personally, beyond just doing the same thing over and over again. Because I think that's ultimately what's in our hearts, is we don't want the repetition of sameness, of what you call it, Caleb, what was the art called? That is a problem. Like what?
Derivative.
Derivative.
We don't want the repetitive, derivative, singular, non-relevant content to be what our churches continue to build our bases on, because that isn't working and it will continue not to work. However, where's the space in which you can find those things, even if it's derivative to church A, but it's valuable to church B, then church B continue to lean into the thing that is most relevant to community. So I just want to make sure that people hear that, and that we don't build a bunch of people that are resenting their church playing Oceans. If your church is playing Oceans 6 years in a row every service, then yeah, maybe talk to your worship team or pastor about that. But I want to encourage, and I also want the challenge. So
It might also be worth talking, so the next conversation might be more personal to us than generally applicable, but I know relatively speaking, all three of us have gone to not worship services, but music concerts and whatnot, that have had overtones of spirituality and worship aesthetics and everything like that all are also extremely different from a church service. Maybe some of them a little bit more than others. Zach, I know you recently went to go see the Christian band that swears sometime, right? I think that's what they're called.
I recently saw Emery in kind of like a stripped down show. It's called Songs and Stories, in which they played for about 3 hours and intertwined their experiences. They took questions from the crowd, and they also played music in a stripped down setting. And I also recently went to King's Kaleidoscope in DC. King's Kaleidoscope is another band that they got some feedback from one song because they used the no word. I think we could sit here and talk about this forever, because back in college, Caleb and I listened to a ton of hardcore music, and during that time in college, I swear this will connect. During that time in college, there was kind of I don't want to say it was a trend. There was a wave of spirit-filled hardcore music in which I experienced some of the most life-giving, fulfilling, wholesome, connecting moments with God inside of a mosh pit, getting punched by people that I had ever experienced in my life. I think we brought it up to one of our professors who was talking about the theology of music, and we dominated the class every once in a while to help them understand that this was a viable form. And I think I think what he said is it's almost primal in a way, the experience of worship. And I think that's kind of funny, but the bottom line is that those settings, there's something about the energy and the experience that, I know the Bible talks a lot about not to trust our emotions, but also I believe there's a space in which the Holy Spirit allows us to experience things. And I think there's live settings like this, the hardcore bands that we saw over the years, King's Kaleidoscope, Emery. There's something about the energy in that moment, the unification of the people in the crowd, and then the true heart, the true spirit that's behind and undertone the music that made those experiences. I mean, truthfully, to this day, some of my best worship experiences, even even Emery with the stripped down experience, even King's Kaleidoscope, me with a photography camera running around and just seeing an entire room of people just excited and like life being given to them. There's just something about those kind of experiences that I have not experienced in the same way within a church for a very long time. That's not to say I haven't experienced life-giving experiences.
You have
but
been
it's
in
like
a
they're
mosh pit in
two.
a church service?
I haven't been in
a while.
Well, we did go to a couple back in college. We brought a mosh pit to some churches.
That's for sure.
But I think in a way it's almost like different delineations of what a worshipful art experience is like, and what I've experienced in concerts to some extent has differed from what I've experienced in services. There is a crossover. It's like a Venn diagram. They're never exactly the same, but there is that unified center that always I think makes those concert experiences the most life-giving, especially when they are centered on Christ, which is interesting. Because you guys went to a concert recently from a band called Swans, and they do not have, if we're looking at Venn diagrams, they don't have that little connected Venn diagram center, but you guys can talk more about that.
They might be two different things.
Caleb, I want to say one thing about what you said before I switch to Swans real quick. When it comes to like the hardcore worship experiences, like obviously aesthetically and the emotion, the drive in the room is very different than that of a normal worship service. But I also think there's something to be said about that kind of music. You don't have to like the music, it's fine, but it allows us to get a almost a different perspective on God and worshiping different parts about who he is, because yes, certainly the I love you, Jesus, thank you for everything you've done for me, that is something we should be thanking and worshiping God for every single day. And also the power and the authority over death, hell, and the grave is something that I don't care what anybody says. Sleeping Giant's going to be able to stomp that into the ground more than Hillsong will ever be able to do. And you can't convince me otherwise, right? So different genres of music allow us to reflect different parts of our creator back, which I think is really cool. That being said, Swans is a very different picture. Swans is, okay. If you've never heard of Swans, that's fine. You probably don't want to hear of Swans, and that's
if you've ever heard a wood chipper that's breaking down.
Oh my gosh,
I'm so sorry.
I have a couple Swans albums on the wall behind me. Well, there's one up there, and there's another one on the shelf over here. But they are a very experimental noise rock band. They've been around since the 80s. They're not
Can you say that word again?
Experimental noise rock band.
Yeah. Sorry, man.
They make noise. They use a lot of noise. They are, I think Nick can attest to this, by probably a factor of 3 or 4, the loudest band I've ever heard in my life. Live, if we did not bring earplugs, Nick and I both would have left within probably 5 minutes. Wow. It would have been unbearably loud. But their music is, although it is not Christian music, it's not intended to be. I would absolutely say that it is spiritual music. That is intended to sort of aesthetically get you in the direction of thinking about whether that be the supernatural, whatever their word for it is. It doesn't matter. They don't really talk about it. And most of their music doesn't even have any lyrics or very few lyrics. So it's more of just a vibe. And the certainly experimental, and the tones that were going on and the aesthetics of the music absolutely brought me into, I would say, a spiritual place. Now there might be some listening, and I can understand the idea of listening to spiritual music that isn't Christian music there is a danger involved that I want to acknowledge, right? You need to be careful about your spirit and what you're bringing in and what you're not bringing in. And the safest route is probably going to be to stick with the people who read the same book that you do, right? But I do think, relatively speaking, for mature Christians who have a sense of discernment about the spirit of sort of what's going on, and also is able to claim some dominion over art, all things are sort of worship the creator, whether they know it or not, to an extent. I think it does sort of allow you the opportunity to see an image of God through the eyes of someone who hasn't met him yet. And there's something fascinating about that. There is a an honest like yearning, like this strong desire to want to experience it, and yet like he doesn't have it, like, but there's a desperation there that like number one wants me to go talk. I want to go talk with him about, but all at the same time, like a desperation that I feel like that I miss having grown up with that, having grown up with God already. You know what I mean? And I do think that that is something that we often do tend to lack in Christian art circles, because it's sort of taking for granted the gift that we've already been given, perhaps the gift that we had already grew up with, so we don't understand what it's like otherwise. But to hear someone like earnestly pushing out of his soul, like the dude, the lead guy, who's a bit of a jerk, I will admit, but he's like a jerk. He's like 80 years old, like he's an old guy, and he is like trying his hardest to connect with something beyond himself. He's working so hard to do it, harder than I've ever seen someone on like a CCM stage do. And that is inspiring. And there was value in it for me personally. Nick, I don't know. You went to say you're not as much of a biggest a fan of Swans as I am. Sure. I think that's safe to acknowledge. But I'm curious what your experience was like in that setting.
Nick's like, I want to leave because you're a heretic.
Right. It's funny because I kind of like poo-pooed it at the beginning here and whatnot. And, a lot of that was just for the joke. But like, I would say we definitely agree that going to a Swans concert is about something you do once a year.
Yes. Yes.
Like when I think of the music that I listen to when I'm really trying to get into a worshipful mindset, it's either me on my guitar, or I'm listening to like Sigur Rós, I'm listening to Hammock, I'm listening to kind of that ethereal ambient kind of noise, right? And there's a weird, we're talking about Venn diagrams, there's a weird overlap between Swans and that music. And I find it really strange because like it's both kind of noise. Yours is just really loud.
Yes.
All that to say, like I'm sitting there and I'm listening to the music and I'm like, it's a very different experience because instead of people like being like, oh yeah, like the whole Taylor Swift idea of like everyone yelling and screaming, everyone like was just very chill. And there were certainly moments where like something amazing happened, a technical thing, like drummer did some really crazy I'm not a drummer, so I'm not going to pretend like I know words. Yeah, sure. Like a fill. I was going to say like a flam or something like that. And you'd hear somebody like, "Oh yeah," like they'd be really happy about it, right? But for the most part, I'm just standing there, and I am closing my eyes, and I'm listening to the music, and I'm listening to the picture that it creates in my brain, and like there are certainly moments where I was like, this is so loud and I don't know where this is going and I don't like the pictures it's giving me. But there are also moments where I'm like, man, this is really cool. And there were certainly moments where I was enjoying myself. I think that's a bit of a joke because like, it is noise rock. And so there are definitely moments where the artist's goal was not to make you comfortable.
Yeah. It's worth noting that Swans will take you to heaven and they will take you to hell and you'll be dancing back and forth. There are some very intense, not necessarily lyrically as much, but like musically. Oh, no. If you go to try to listen, then prepare for some difficult music.
I mean, there's even something valuable of like the interaction with the band members, right? Like to get very artsy or whatever, like everyone's coming together with this unique different sound to create a overall together image with their music. And there are so many moments where like the lead, like he was the lead vocalist because the only one doing vocals, but like the 80-year-old jerk that you were talking about, he would stand up and he would dance, but then he would also like conduct the other individuals. And I just remember some like those were my favorite parts, is like the team coming together and making this stuff, and it felt very on the spot. Like I don't know if they rehearsed it, but there was something very beautiful about the chaos that had some form of organization around it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
I really enjoyed that. I think as we're coming to kind of like the close of the conversation, I want to kind of like transition us so that we can kind of bookend this. We started with Taylor Swift. We arrived at Swans.
Made it to Swans.
So I think as we're talking about this conversation today of how can something like Taylor Swift, or even how can something like Swans affect our church services, I think that there's just a necessary recognition of what is the way in which our community can, and we should be encouraging people to connect with God, and not just in the 2 hours of a Sunday, but in every other day of the week, because ultimately, like, our faith is founded, of course, on a relationship with God, and that doesn't just happen once a week. So there's a necessity to pursue that. And if you guys don't mind, I want to throw out something on the back end here, like a little bit of a solution, so that we're not just talking in our experiences, and we're not just talking in the vague cultural direction, but also like a really practical experience. There's something that my church has kind of engaged with from a while back. It's a book. It's a book by. Let me find it. I literally just had it here. It's called "Sacred Pathways: Discovering Your Soul's Path to God" by Gary Thompson, in which he describes 9 different spiritual styles or sacred pathways. Because every single person, the reality of every single person, is that we all connect with God in a unique and different way. So, if you guys don't mind, I'm just going to run through those 9 sacred pathways really fast. I highly recommend you check out the book, and I think there's even a test online as well, in which you can kind of like figure out what is a sacred pathway. So I'll just kind of break those down, unless you guys have any other transitional thoughts.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So the 9 sacred pathways, the first one is a naturalist. So loving God outdoors. How many of us say, when I get, like myself, I say this all the time, my favorite vacation usually is at the ocean. There's something about being on the water or on the beach and just being present. The noise of this. There's a reason that the ocean is a noisemaker sound, right? Because we connect with God in the outdoors. So the naturalist is loving God outdoors. The sensate is loving God with the senses. So what are the ways in which we're experiencing God with our taste, our touch, our smell, our sight, our sound? So maybe that's a scent that you associate kind of with the church or with experiencing God. Maybe that's visuals. Maybe this is kind of like the engaging with visual art, like going, like I recently went to New York City and got to engage with a lot of art at the moment there. Like, what are the ways in which we're engaging God with our senses? Number 3 is the traditionalist. So loving God through ritual and symbol. Like, I feel like a lot of, especially like Catholic-based traditions, early traditional churches, like things that are very ritual and symbol for some people, those are deeply connecting with God. The next one, number 4, is I apologize if I say this wrong. The ascetic. Loving God in solitude and simplicity. So this is spending time in breathing in by yourself in solitude, getting away, being intentional, pulling your time with God in silence and solitude and simplicity. Number 5 is the activist, loving God through confrontation, which is interesting. So this is talking like justice, prayer walking, intercessory prayer, connecting with God in ways that are extremely active and engaging, but also that help you grow closer to what you feel called to. Number 6 is the caregiver, loving God by loving others. So service, hospitality, mentoring. That's another way we can connect with God. Number 7 is enthusiast, loving God with mystery and celebration. So conversational prayer, worship. These are things in which we can put our emotions into loving God and even engaging with the concepts of mystery that the Bible is so founded on. Number 8 is contemplative. So loving God through adoration. So this is breathing prayer, centering prayer, those kind of practices that really are contemplating, a lot of sitting with your feelings and emotions and processing your experience. And then the last one is intellectuals, loving God with the mind. So this is classic pastoral stuff, right? Bible study, memorization, one-to-one witness, doing deep biblical research about concepts and ideas. Those all 9 of those spiritual pathways are ways in which we can engage with God. And if you hear what I worked through there, worship, congregational worship, was not necessarily in every single one of them. I think worship was maybe mentioned loosely. You could connect worship to 2 or 3 of them, but there are 9 sacred pathways in which we can invite God into our relationship that is unique to us. So how can we as a church invite people into those different sacred pathways outside of just worship?
Right.
I think an assessment of those things is a way we can practically understand where our culture is going with experiences and make those experiences that much more connected with the foundation of all that God is.
I think it makes me think of a personal experience I've had relatively recently. I was diagnosed with ADHD and started taking medication. And it's been changing my life. It's been very, very helpful. But I've only ever experienced church up until a month or two ago with ADHD. And there has been some things that have always been just very difficult for me to connect with and understand. And like mostly being the last 30 minutes of any sermon. The first 5 minutes, I'm usually great. And then I start flying off pretty hard. And then all of a sudden I experienced it like with a regular, functional mind with my medication, and all of a sudden, like, I can pay attention and I can listen, and realizing how much our church services are built for a kind of person that I was not, right? And I wonder, being, Zach, you mentioned 9 spiritual pathways. I'm sure there's dozens of them in total, like of all the different ways that people connect with God. But if our church services are built and work really well with, like you said, 2 or 3 out of the 9, then that's a majority of people that still the way that they best connect with God, they are not experiencing in a church. Absolutely, there is a difference between personal worship and experience with God versus a corporate setting, and some of those are certainly a lot harder to be able to execute corporately all together, on Sunday morning as opposed to others. But I do think for pastors, for worship pastors, who have routinely used this specific medium for achieving a spirit and atmosphere of worship for the congregation to jump into. Perhaps there are some alternatives that might be worth looking at, that might not be an every Sunday thing. It might not be an every month thing, but every once in a while, changing it up can go a lot of ways to help reframe how people look at and experience and worship God. And I don't think that's a bad thing in almost any case.
Yeah, man. I Zach, you mentioned that stuff. I remember hearing that before, but it kind of is a little discouraging in my own mindset of like, we already recognize and understand that there are differences of worship for individuals. And yet we kind of have stuck in this mold for the past 100 years, just change the style and the how things look. Right?
Probably a lot longer than that.
Yeah, and it's like it certainly there are things that are happening culturally where we're coming to a better understanding that ADHD is a thing, right? And how common it is with people, and understand that people are not all the same cookie cutter when it comes to how they interact with God, right? There's certainly an amount of education that has to have happened. But yeah, it just really reinforces in my mind how much I want to see us try to break that mold. And like you said, Caleb, I think there are definitely reasons why Sunday morning kind of has to be the way that it is. But there are other opportunities. There's Wednesday nights, there are Thursday nights, there are Monday nights. There are a lot of other ways I feel like perhaps we could make the space within our own congregations to explore those more.
And I do think just as we're landing, I just want to make sure we're addressing Richard Lake's statement about what's the difference. To some extent, is there a caution that our performance isn't equated to the experience? And I think that addressing and navigating these kind of spiritual pathways, I think that's where we can kind of find those answers of difference of is what we're doing on a Sunday, has that been boiled down to performance in the hearts of those that are on stage and in the hearts of the community? Like, are we leading, or are our pastors leading people to recognize that sometimes the fleeting emotion that we're feeling, that we're engaging with when that moment of oceans hits, is that performance, or is that truly connecting with God? And I think there's a necessary element in which our leadership of the church and our community has to address that. And there's also a necessary element in which we personally have to address and assess that. If we're not doing those things, if we're not addressing the sacred pathways, if we're not learning how to best connect with God outside of the hour that we're being fed on a Sunday, I think that's when something like that can be worrisome. And I think when a church culture develops a performance-centric mentality, I think that can be seen. I think we've seen that a lot. So what are the ways in which you're inviting in which you're recognizing the value and the emotion of performance, but you're moving closer to a relationship with God that looks more like art? I think maybe that's a way to go.
Yeah, and I think because I certainly hear what you're saying, Richard, and even as someone who participated in the Assemblies of God National Fine Arts Festival in the worship arts category, the performance in our culture has always been a big deal, making sure we're playing the right notes and that you're jumping around, that you're super excited, and all that kind of stuff. And I do think in general that there's too much of a focus on it. But I also think at the same note that whoever your worship leader is, and really the whole team, I think of it as sort of like the quarterback of this experience, right? And that the person who is the captain, the team lead of this worship experience should be working harder than anybody else. They should be the bar for everybody to see and look how fervently that person is worshiping.
And authentically.
Right? This is someone who means what they say, and every word out of their mouth is something that they believe very strongly, and it's inspiring, and it's a goal to work up to, so that we can all be brought in, because worship requires effort. There's no doubt in my mind it should require effort from you, right?
And sacrifice.
And when you see someone on Sunday morning that is putting in that effort, it inspires us as the congregation to be able to do it. So the performance element of it is not the important part, but it is a piece of the picture that encourages our congregation to be able to dive in. The only other thing I'll say, because I know we're at 1:30 and we have to end, is Zach, I feel like your points would have been twice as strong if you had the vampire teeth in, and I'm bummed.
Oh shoot! Yeah, man, you got to put them back in.
I don't know if I have them right. I wanted to stick.
Wait. What?
Yes, of course. I feel like I'm changing the accent from the beginning to the end. Well, guys, we should probably land this conversation because once again, even with two topics, we are going over time. There's the list again. Thank you so much for enjoying this conversation. Hopefully you enjoyed what we had to say. I'm really excited about how it went. Hopefully you don't believe we're any more heretics than we are, but if you do, or would you like to continue the conversation, you can hop over to the Discord, and we'd love to talk more about this because clearly we're very passionate about this idea. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you had fun. Thank you for those that participated in the comments. Please continue to do that. I'm having a hard time talking, so we're going to go ahead and land out this podcast. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Blackbar podcast, and enjoy the conversation and where it went. Thank you, guys. Appreciate you.